This is the Inspired Pilot Podcast, episode 24.
Keep good records because someday you'll be needing to remember those things so that you can tell the stories that will help someone else.
Welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast with your host, Marvin Robinson. Inspiring stories from inspiring pilots from around the world.
Okay, welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast. This is Marvin Robinson, and I'm delighted to introduce today's featured inspiring pilot, Kahn. Welcome to the show, Karen. Are you ready to inspire today?
You bet. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Kahn piloted her first flight at the age of 19, and then 9 years later, in 1977, was one of the first women hired by a major airline. Kahn, now retired from a 36-plus year airline pilot career with Continental, now United Airlines. A speaker and author of the self-help book Flight Guide for Success, Tips and Tactics for the Aspiring Airline Pilot, Kahn is committed to excellence. She is a Master CFI, a FAA Aviation Safety Counselor, Director of the California Pilots Association, and a current 4-term airport commissioner in her hometown of Santa Barbara, California in the United States. Okay, I've given our listeners, the Inspired Pilots, a real short introduction, Kahn. Can you take a minute and tell us a little bit about yourself personally?
I started out in flying, like probably most of you did, as someone who had been fascinated by airplanes since childhood. I loved them, I wanted to be around them, but I never really thought it could happen to me. When I was 19, I met a friend who said, much like you would find today, if you want to learn how to fly, you go out to the airport, take an introductory lesson. I did, and I will tell you that in those days, as I remember fondly, it was, are you ready for this? $5. Don't we wish the price was the same now, but nothing is the same price. So after my $5 ride, I thought, wow, that is really cool. And to do something for a living that you love to do anyway and find eventually a way to be paid for it is really my goal. So with that, I kept flying. I ended up taking jobs at the airport, figuring I need to be where the action is. I need to be around the people who can help me. And it's not going to be sitting in somebody's office.
Fantastic.
As I progressed through my ratings, I got my private pilot license, and that took me almost 6-8 months. I didn't have enough money, so each time I got enough together for another lesson, I would race on out to the airport. And of course, once I passed solo and got into the cross-country phase, that's when things started slowing down, of course, because it took more money to do those cross-country flights. But eventually I did get my private license. That was June of 1969 in Novato, California at Ganas Field. I then went to work for the FBO out at the airport and eventually got enough flight time. In those days, the next thing you would get was your commercial license. And then finally got an instrument rating. And one day I came across a guy who'd been a customer at the FBO. And he was all excited. He was a local newscaster from the NBC station in San Francisco, and he was buying a new, for him, Cessna 182. And I got bold and said to myself, now's the time to dive in and see what I can do. So I said to him, you may not know it, but what you need is me to fly your airplane because I understand that you are starting up a new business and doing aerial photography. So that was my first job in flying and worked for him for several years, decided I wanted more training, qualified for an instrument rating, and eventually went back, got a multi-engine rating, as well as a certificated flight instructor. I got my flight instructor license in the summer of 1973 and also spent some time flying gliders, which is lots of fun, and was also, it turns out, very pivotal in my really learning how to properly control an airplane. Because, of course, without the engine, you soon learn that you have to have some feeling as to what's going on.
Definitely.
I spent a year, I got my flight instructor certificate in the summer of 1973. And very shortly thereafter, I was talking with the examiner. I had told him that I was really interested in instrument flying. I didn't know that I was really wanting to teach people to fly, but I wanted to learn how to fly. And I had very early on figured out that if I was going to be hired as a professional pilot, I would very likely be sitting in the right seat of something, or I hoped that it would be big enough that there would be a right seat to be occupied. And I thought learning what you needed to know to be a good flight instructor was a great idea because you would be sitting in the same seat that hopefully you would hope to be hired into. I ended up getting the flight instructor license, and right about that point, Sierra Academy in Oakland, California, which was quite a large flight school, particularly in the days of the GI Bill, which of course gave a lot of U.S. returning servicemen the opportunity to use their funds for flight training. So I was actually, I went to Sierra Academy to get my instrument instructor license, and about the third day I was there, they asked me if I'd like to come to work for them as an instructor. And I said, sure, but I just got my license 3 weeks ago. I don't really know enough to teach anybody anything.
It was still nice and shiny, wasn't it?
Oh, exactly. And they said, hey, we have a bunch of guys who want flight instructor licenses, and you just took the exam and you just took the check ride. So we would like to have you to show them what they need to know. And I thought, well, okay.
I like the logic there, Karen.
Well, it was great logic, but and it would have been fine in most cases. But of course, I ended up getting a student at that time who was sure he knew everything about instructing. And of course, the funny thing is I had come from a small airport, Ganas Field, uncontrolled 3,300-foot runway. And I was now doing this flying at Oakland, which is a large airport by most standards and has not only one, but 2 control towers. So I thought, is there a way I could use my lack of knowledge to, should we say, bluff my way through, since I have a student who thinks he knows everything? Well, that's good. Let's let him teach me what he thinks he knows about everything, because I'm actually somebody who doesn't know, and I need to learn.
Fake it until you make it, Karen. I like that.
Exactly. So I kind of said, all right, George, I'm going to be your new student. And I know you're almost, completed your flight instructor rating here, but let's pretend I'm somebody new to the Oakland airport who's never flown out of a controlled airport with a control tower for probably more than, 5 to 10 hours of my, I think, total, couple hundred hours at this point. So could you help me get familiar? Of course, what he didn't know is I wasn't kidding. I was telling him the truth. And I thought, I'll just get him to teach me all this stuff and see what kind of a job he did. So with that, I survived that student, who, interestingly enough, I encountered many years later, and he had gotten hired by United Airlines, so I was pleased.
Did you tell him the truth?
No, I never did, because he was the second officer on a flight I got on board, and I thought, oh, he doesn't need to know.
He doesn't need to know.
A lot of it in inspiring confidence is what you don't say. It's how you act. And, I once wrote out a very interesting mnemonic that was the word aspire, ASPIRE. A successful professional inspires real excellence.
Nice.
And I've been using that and figured, as you right, if you have to fake it, fine. What they don't know. So with that, I got my CFI and ended up working at Sierra Academy in Oakland for about a year, instructed about 800 hours. And like most instructors at the time, everybody was looking to get more flight time in order to move on to another, hopefully bigger aircraft job. I had an opportunity to go fly for a company in Oklahoma that was doing weekend ground schools, teaching pilots how to pass their written examinations. And they had said that you could either take the airline ticket they would give you to fly off for the weekend to your destination for teaching, or you could pair up with your other instructor and rent an airplane and fly there. So I thought this was a great idea. This was going to be a way I could actually do some flying and not just spend my time in the right seat talking to basic students. That was the good news. So the bad news was the place went bankrupt 2 months after I got there.
Had you invested any money?
Fortunately not. What I realized was a lot of the business was actually on the West Coast. I was living in Oklahoma. I was a West Coast person. And so a friend of mine and I decided we could tell what they had done wrong. They had a lot of fancy offices in places that none of the students ever got to benefit from. And it was also, by the way, a cash basis that they were running their school on. And it turned out to be a, should we say, a setting that was somewhat ripe for, should we say, ripoff. So with that, a friend of mine and I started up another school because the other one we'd been at, of course, was now bankrupt. It was also the best excuse I could figure out to own an airplane and have a business that had a real necessity to pay for it. So with that, I managed to buy my first airplane, a 1960 N model Bonanza. And we spent the first 3-4 months flying back and forth across the Rockies because once again, we figured out that most of the business was on the West Coast. With that, my friend who had lived in Santa Barbara said, why don't we move the company to the West Coast? And I said, great. And of course, I've been here ever since and delighted. We worked at that business until one day, about 1977, after I had gotten my airline transport pilot license, and was hoping that the airlines would start to hire, because of course that's the problem, is not only having the qualifications, but having your timing correct and being at the beginning of the hiring. So fortunately, the airlines had started to hire. I had a friend of mine who was a pilot for United Airlines, and one day he asked me if I wanted to go down to Los Angeles with him. He was going to pick up his paycheck. So I said, sure. And he says, I'm going to take you over to Continental. My best friend works there, and I think they're hiring, and let's go get you an application. So we stopped there. I go in, get the application, head out the door, and my friend says, where are you going? And I said, I got to take the application home, type it up, and get all the right flight times and that. He says, no. You're going to stay right here, fill it out to the best of your memory. It's timing is everything in this business, so fill it out. So I sat down and do what I would never recommend to my clients at my firm, Aviation Career Counseling, where we do interview and pilot career counseling. I sat down and I hand wrote out the application, gave them the best numbers I could remember. And when I went to hand it in, I asked the lady at the desk, where can I make a copy of this? And she said, well, we don't have a copy machine. She said, but what job are you applying for? And I said, pilot. And she said, how much flight time have you got? And I said, about 2,000 hours. She says, oh, well, listen, there's a copy machine at the 7-Eleven store down the street. And when you come back, be sure you put your application in this pile, not that pile.
Wow.
So that was kind of the beginning of it. I came back, got a call 2 days later. I went for an interview. In those days, Continental had 2 women pilots out of their 1,200 or so pilots. And I was the 4th woman hired in 1977. Started out as a flight engineer on the 727. They call them second officers because they're also pilots as opposed to just being people who can run the flight engineers panel. And they would eventually move up to first officer, co-pilot, and captain.
Okay. I'll tell you what, let's jump back a bit, I think. I'm really interested in how your career sort of transposed from 1977. Okay, so if you can take it all the way back, let's go back to way back, like back to the beginning. We sort of skipped over that a little bit in 1969 with when you got your PPL.
Right.
Let's go back to that. So what actually, what was your driver? Why did you actually want to become a pilot in the first place?
Well, I had gone through college not liking any of the subjects I was studying. And looking back at it, I thought, if I had known that I wanted to be a pilot, I would have gone to an aviation college, or at least gotten myself into an environment that had aviation as a fairly strong suit in their setting. Unfortunately, I went to a liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest and was terribly bored with it, actually left after 2 years and thought, someday I'll want to go back to college, but I'd like to not waste my parents' money. So when I happened to stumble upon aviation, I was just thrilled. I started that flying at that local FBO, and it was like I was like a sponge. Couldn't get enough of it, was passionate about it, and recognized it was going to be a long, hard road. On the other hand, it was something I loved to do.
Yeah.
So that was really what kept me kind of thirsting for more and more knowledge. And I had no clue, because in those days, nobody was hiring women. And I could remember applying to airlines and not giving them my first name. I would give them my first initial and my middle initial. And when it said military service, I'd write NA and hope not applicable and hope that they didn't notice. Because in those days, I can't recall if they were actually asking gender listings, but eventually, of course, that became not legal in the United States to do. But, I found it was the first time I was really excited about anything. And I thought I had a fairly good flair for. So with that, I was so excited to find something I really loved to do.
Yeah.
That was the real impetus to move on and stay in the field and do whatever it took to stay in the field.
So you got a little taste of the PPL. Were you watching aircraft flying? What was the key moment which, that little spark that lit the fire in your belly to want to fly? What was the driver? What was the first initial spark?
I think the real thing is the freedom it provides and the opportunity to go anywhere and do anything. And ever since that day, I've always been amazed that as long as you're willing to sit for long enough, you can get to most anywhere within reason. But I've always liked the fact that there are basically no boundaries. You're kind of your own boss. You get to do what you want. You are the controller of your destiny. And that was what I found was really exciting. And the challenge, also the immediate feedback was a big thing for me. Knowing immediately that you'd done something right, or in some cases, something wrong.
Fantastic. I like that. Yeah. Okay, right. So you've obviously discussed that you have been a flight instructor. I mentioned in the bio that you're a master flight instructor now. Obviously, you've instructed a lot of students, but let's go back to when you were a student, Karen. So let's go back to during your initial training, when you were actually doing your PPL training, you were in the left-hand seat with the instructor on the right-hand seat. For the benefit of someone sitting on the fence, thinking whether to learn to fly, or someone currently, in training now with their own challenges, what did you find challenging as a student pilot, and how did you overcome that challenge?
I think one of the more important things I found, I was always very eager to read and absorb as much knowledge as I could. To me, the lessons were very expensive, and I wanted to be prepared. So I was someone who would read and reread the material. I would come prepared with a list of questions. I would go out to the airport, listen in on conversations, try to get as much information as I could. In those days, there weren't a lot of flying magazines. I would read them all. I was kind of like a sponge saying, wow, this is really exciting. And I can remember at a point in my career where I had maybe 200-300 hours, and I read a story about a woman who was the first pilot to fly a Learjet. I think it was the precursor of NetJets. And of course, they were trying to sell type ratings at the time, but thinking how inspiring it was to get to absorb more advanced material. I actually went out to Cleveland or wherever they were located at the time, sat in on a day of their ground school thinking, whatever I can do to put myself in the path of opportunity is what I want to do. Because really, particularly in aviation, your job is to show the people who can help you that you're worth helping. And that's pretty much what my book is all about. How do you demonstrate that you're serious, that you're worth helping? Because none of us want to waste our help on somebody who's not serious.
That's true.
So it was being there as much as you could. That's why I eventually said, this is silly. I was working at a secretarial job at a hardware society and said, this is money, but I need a job at the airport. I need to be there. So when there's an opportunity and I get to meet some people, I'm there. It's not a case of, oh, yeah, if you show up next Tuesday, but I can't get next Tuesday off from work. So it was really figuring out that, location. And in those days, as it is today, being where the action is, even if you have to sweep floors, is one of the best ways to get noticed as somebody who's serious.
Okay, so your challenge was you wanted to immerse yourself as much as possible in everything in aviation. So you fixed that challenge by getting a job at the airfield.
Right. And it was also a problem that my parents were totally against my flying. And it was like, and I didn't learn until maybe 15, 18 years ago, that when I started learning to fly, my mother said to her sister, my aunt, well, Karen might as well have committed suicide. So with that, I didn't have encouragement. I didn't have a mentor. And to me, when I hear these days of people who, are trying to encourage their children to learn to fly, I think, wow, are you lucky if you had a mom or dad who was out there trying to encourage you? Don't I wish?
Your mother said Karen's almost virtually committed suicide. So what was she thinking at that time? What did they want you to do at that time?
She wanted me to be a nurse. And of course, it was very funny because I later figured out I was terribly squeamish and I pass out at the sight of blood. So I thought, great occupation for a nurse.
Thank the world for Karen's flying ability.
Yes, right. So it was kind of a case of, this is something I love to do. Aviation is a real passion and I'm going to stick with it. I don't care if my parents don't like it. Eventually, I convinced them that the best way to keep me from killing myself in an airplane was to help me with some funds for an instrument rating, because, of course, that was going to help keep me up right side up in the clouds.
Good.
And then eventually didn't have to spend a lot of my time worrying about what they thought, since, I was making the usual dirt wages, but I was doing something that I love to do. As it turned out, once I got hired by Continental, they were very proud of me, although my generation of parents were of the type who were never going to admit that to their children. They would tell their friends, however. So.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, excellent. I like that. So I like the way, 1969, you got your PPL, you went on to get your CPL. Was that just a natural progression from the PPL? Once you had that taste of flight and your private pilot's license, was that it? Gung-ho, I want to be a professional pilot? It
was, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. There weren't any women airline pilots, certainly none that I knew of. Yeah. We did have one United pilot who I know owned an S model Bonanza. We used to see him fly in and out of our field. It was funny, later I had him on my airplane several times later. It was kind of like old home week, But it was more a case of my saying, what can I do to bring myself closer to my goal? I need to stay in the environment. I need to learn as much as I can. I need to get a variety of information. I need to meet a variety of people. I need to sell myself to the people who can help me. So with that, the commercial license in those days was the next one you would get rather than the instrument rating. And then eventually they changed the requirements, I think, for the instrument rating in the United States, so that became the second rating, the commercial the third. But I knew I wanted to earn money. I wanted to do some teaching. So after getting my commercial license, the next thing, I actually started to work for the guy with the 182, doing some aerial photography, getting some interesting experience flying to some places, doing some extensive cross-country work. I think we flew across the United States to Alabama at one point. We did some flying up in Canada. I had my first taste of what it's like to fly in the vicinity of a forest fire, because smoke and airplanes are not a fun combination.
Tell us a little story about that then.
Well, my boss had a job doing some aerial photography and ground photography for a very wealthy industrialist who was doing, nobody could quite figure out what we thought he was trying to make heavy water or to do something having to do with some chemical reaction, but he was doing a lot of mining work up in near Kamloops and 𝗟𝗶𝗃 in British Columbia. And so we had flown up there. And it was the Fraser River Canyon in Canada is just gorgeous, but it's a very high canyon. And of course, flying in there, we were landing on a dirt strip that was at the river bottom. I remember one night we arrived overhead, and of course, no way was anybody going to land. The smoke was terribly dense because the place was on fire. And that probably had to do with the state of our weather reporting in those days. Unless you were going into somebody's big city, there just wasn't any.
Yeah.
So we had a bird dog ADF, which was a gauge that had markings 45 degrees either side of straight ahead. And that was the limit of where your ADF needle would point to. You could be straight ahead, or it could be all the way over to 45 left or 45 right.
Is that it? Yeah.
Yeah. And when you hit the 45 degrees, you hit the stop. So you could be 45 or more degrees away. Yeah. So we ended up with some help from air traffic control, as I recall, landing in Kamloops, British Columbia, and spending the night there. Finally flew back, landed. But it was a real interesting case of at night, over the mountains in a single engine airplane with smoke, unfamiliar. Fortunately, as I recall, we didn't have any weather, but it was quite an eye-opener for me that there was an awful lot I had to learn. And I've always thought that even though I spent 36 plus years flying airliners, what I know about various specialized segments of aviation, in many cases, can be written on the back of my hand. Yeah. So I'm always of the mind that there's an awful lot out there I don't know. And airline flying is one of the easier things in the world because you have so much assistance. When you have to do it all yourself, you've got a very different proposition.
Excellent. So yeah, I totally agree with you there. Especially now, there's a lot of automation on it. I am aware that back in 1977, the automation levels were definitely less than they are now, but there is definitely lots of standard operating procedures that do sort of protect you guys. But yeah, if you're in a 182 over a forest fire, you're definitely on your own there as pilot in command.
Yep.
Okay. Well, I think since 1969, you've been through it all. You've got a massive amount of flying activity. Before we jump further into your journey, let's have a look at aircraft types, okay? Because I know you're going to mention a few of these now. So let's just get a roundup before we continue on your journeys at Continental. So how many different aircraft types have you flown so far, Karen? And what is which aircraft do you hold the closest to your heart and why?
Boy, I started learning how to fly in a Cherokee 140 because I was learning at what was a Piper dealer at Marin County Airport, Ganos Field, Novato, California. From that, I went there. I flew a Cherokee 180. I ended up then moving across the field to work for the new Cessna dealer. So, of course, there were Cessna 150s and 172s. Worked for a guy who had a Cessna 182. I'm thinking that I owned a Bonanza and eventually owned a second Bonanza. One was a B-35. Most of my general aviation flying was kind of limited to either the people I was working for or the flight school or rentals place that I was working at. I think I had some time in a Beach Musketeer, Beach Sport. I had some friends I went up with, and I think I flew a Mooney once or twice. The place where I did work at Ganos Field the owner had a lot of historic aircraft, so I, got to handle the controls of a Ford trimotor, although I don't particularly call that flying one.
I'll take that though, Karen. I would say, yep.
Yeah. I flew with a guy. I did some ferrying with a guy later after I went to work for the airlines who was ferrying aircraft to Honolulu, and we did a couple of Oakland to Honolulu runs in a Twin Beach, a Bullpar turboliner. Nice. We went in Mitsubishi MU2 once. I went in a Navajo once. But as far as ever having, enough time to claim that I actually knew something about it, no, for the most part. I can remember one of my first twin engine opportunities was with the salesman at the Cessna dealer who said, I have a flight down to San Jose, California, about an hour away from here, to demonstrate this twin to somebody who's interested in buying it. Would you like to come with me? So we flew down there. I was in the right seat. I can't remember if I was the right or the left seat. I'm going to guess I was in the right, but I'm flying. And once we landed and the passengers got out, they kind of said something like, gee, you do a really nice job. How much multi-engine time have you got? I looked at my watch and said, about an hour.
Fantastic.
So, but with that, I highly recommend someone not use that as a as a response. Doesn't inspire confidence, but they had walked away alive, so I figured that was okay. The salesman was an instructor, so I had no problem. I've flown an A36 out of Australia for, I have some friends there who own an airport and a flight school, Lilydale Flying Service in the Yarra Valley, and have had a lot of fun flying around Australia, which I find to be just fascinating, and the place that really needs airplanes and is lucky to have them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So types of aircraft, I would say, and I've owned a Beechcraft B-55 Baron since 1994, which was something I owned after I sold my 182. Yeah. So that, has kind of been for the last 20 years what I had available to me to fly. And once you have your own, the likelihood to do much more flying than anything else.
Yeah, so you've had that Beechcraft 55 for almost 20 years.
Yeah, I have.
Fantastic. And why did you choose the Baron 55?
Well, that was right about the time that my mother had passed away, and I was hoping to get my father to fly more with me. And I knew he was not going to be terribly happy as kind of the, should we say, original doubter, as in those little airplanes will kill you. So we figured having an airplane with 2 engines. And of course, those were the days when, of course, fuel wasn't quite as expensive as it is now. So bought the Baron in 1994 and have owned it ever since, and decided having something that you enjoy flying, and as long as you stay proficient at it, you've got something good and might as well enjoy it.
Yeah. Did you manage to take your father up?
Oh, yes, many times. He lived just up the coast here in the Monterey Carmel area. So that was about an hour's flight in the Baron. So it was also nice as he grew older. It was an easy way for me to get up to see him, particularly with the busy airline schedule that I had for many years.
Fantastic. Okay. So is that all your general aviation aircraft sort of wrapped up there?
I would say so.
Okay. And out of those, there's quite a few types there. Obviously, many training type aircraft, but which is your favorite? I'm going to lean towards the twin engine Baron here. Is that correct?
Oh, yes, most definitely. And of course, now that it has a new panel and I'm trying to figure out how to fly it, I'm sure it will be once I feel comfortable.
Yeah.
But pilots who spend their life in a regimented atmosphere like an airline are used to being very well schooled and versed in what everything does before you ever get to the airplane. So my challenge for the next few months or years is going to be to become comfortable in something that I've recently upgraded to a glass cockpit with things that I'm familiar looking at. But of course, the environment brings back my best words of advice: when all else fails, look outside and fly the airplane.
Absolutely.
Because it still does exactly what it used to do. You just have to not get, shall we say, over-involved in all the bells and whistles.
Yeah. So inside those, especially the older Barons, the panel was quite, like most aircraft of that era, was quite a busy sort of panel. So going from that to a glass panel, definitely a different view, although, like you said, the same information is being depicted, just albeit in a different way. And what was the driver to upgrade to the panel, apart from it looking really cool?
Well, it was a case of I needed to do some upgrading because with the 𝗟𝗶𝗶𝗍 becoming the standard of the United States here in 2020 and finding that my GPS had run out of update cards in 2008 because nobody updates it anymore. And it was getting to be more and more difficult to have the utility out of the airplane that I was looking for. I knew that once I retired from the airline in 2014, I would be interested in making it a more primary source of transportation, which I could do comfortably. And probably the biggest problem was figuring out what I wanted, as opposed to just taking anything that anybody recommended. So I spent quite a bit of time researching it and talking to people, and finally came up with a set of things that I was happy that they were things that would make my flying safer, more comfortable, a little more, should we say, with the times, and work well for me probably to the end of my flying career, which I figure I've got about another probably 20, 22 years.
A few more years past that, I reckon, Karen.
We'll hope so. But put it this way, the best thing you can do is know when it's time to quit. And then you get somebody who likes to fly the airplane and you get to sit in the right seat and let them do all the work.
Fantastic. Love that attitude, Karen. That was really good. Okay. So, all right. So let's jump back to your journey then. Let's go to the point where you get accepted for your job at Continental. So take us back to that moment.
So that's about June of 1977. I got the invitation to join their 9th class of new hire pilots, which was starting in July. 7/11/77. Everybody at any airline always remembers their hire date, since that's almost how everything occurs in seniority order. And I was the only woman in a class of 15 men and me. I had no idea of what to expect. And I realized after the first day, it was like, oh my gosh, what have I gotten myself in for? Because, of course, they gave you stacks of manuals 3 feet high. They gave you schedules that told you what they expected you to learn and how proficient you needed to be by the time you got through 3 weeks of 8 hours a day ground school and passing those tests, and then going on to learning in the simulator and getting through 6 sessions of that in order to become a candidate for a flight engineer certificate, nobody was hired unless they had passed the written examination. So all of us had the paperwork down, but so much of that was kind of boilerplate that didn't have a whole lot really to do with what you needed to know to fly a 727. So with that, the training took about 2.5 months. I know I finally finished my check ride. I used to joke it was an airplane number 711, which it was. And that was in September. I was the fourth woman at Continental. And I remember taking the check ride from the examiner in the simulator, and we showed up in the briefing room and we were standing around kind of chatting. And of course, they usually have several, I think there was an instructor there was myself, and there was the examiner. And I think there was another pilot there. And we were standing around chatting so much. And of course, they referred to you in those days by your first initial, middle initial, and last name, so that on his sheet, he knew that he was examining K.M. Kahn for a flight engineer certificate. And it was funny. He was being so casual that I finally said to him, "You do know that I am your victim for today." He says, "Oh, yeah, we'll get around to it. Don't worry about it." So he was doing a good job of making me feel comfortable. We finished the check ride that went on in the simulator, which was about a 4-hour event. Then they actually had you do some, so that got you your certificate. Then you ended up going on initial operating experience, which was actually going out and flying on initially this was a pilot trainer, which was a live airplane, but it didn't have passengers on it. So they were checking other pilots in the front, left and right seats. And that was in El Paso, Texas. And then you started to work once you had your initial operating experience, where you actually had an instructor flying along with you just to make sure that you were doing it all correctly. So I checked out as a 727 second officer in September, early October of 77, and actually flew as a second officer for the next 6 years. At one point, we had enough growth to make an upgrade possible for me. And in 1979, I upgraded to a co-pilot or first officer on the 727, which lasted for about 6 months until they started to furlough. And as they start to cut jobs behind you, everybody else slides down the pole and you get lower and lower. I was very lucky in that I did not get furloughed. I got the notice, but fortunately they canceled it, and was doing okay until the events of 1981, when Frank Lorenzo made his hostile takeover of Continental Airlines. And finally, in 1983, there was a strike. And then I was on strike for about almost 3 years. While I was on strike, forgot to mention an airplane type.
Tell me.
I actually got a job thanks to a couple of striking Continental pilots who were working for a local gentleman who owned a Jetstar, a Lockheed Jetstar in the Van Nuys area of California. He was using the Jetstar to fly back and forth across the country to, Maryland, where he owned a Toyota distributorship. So their third pilot at this operation was returning to his job at TWA, and I was hired as the third pilot to fly the Jetstar, and had virtually no biz jet or private jet experience, but was eager to learn, and had enough airline experience in procedures and protocols. And one of the people I was working with was also a captain who had been, who was on strike from the airline. So I spent about a year flying the Jetstar.
So this is when you were technically still employed by Continental?
Well, they will tell you that you're not employed if you're on strike.
Okay.
They're not paying you. They're not giving you any benefits, no medical, no nothing. So this was a case of, we were very lucky that the Airline Pilots Association was helping to support those of us who were on strike. It was a case of bankrupting the airline when actually it was, well, I don't want to get into that. Long details.
Yeah.
Quite a bit of aviation history there.
The listeners can Google that, okay?
Yeah, that's a good one. They settled the strike 2 years later, and they returned us to work in seniority order. So I actually went back to work just about 3 years later, and went back as a second officer on the 727, and eventually went to the DC-10 as a first officer flying in the Pacific. I also, thereafter, my first move to the left seat as captain was in a MD-80, McDonnell Douglas MD-80. That's their longer version of the DC-9. And I flew that for about 15 years until I had the chance. Well, they actually began to retire those aircraft. And in 2003, I moved to the Boeing 757 and 767.
Wow. Yeah, I've got a little bit of a soft spot for the MD-80. What kind of advice is, give us some stories about the MD-80 and even in particular, characteristic-wise about this aircraft?
Well, the MD-80 pilots, we always used to joke that you could always tell the MD-80 pilots because they all had beautiful skin because they sweated profusely because the cockpit was so hot. Excellent. On the other hand, we were not deaf because we loved the fact that the segmented windshield that Douglas had determined, they made a center windshield, they made a pilot's windshield, they made a co-pilot's windshield, and they had side windows. That design, as opposed to Boeing, which did only 2 windows in the front and basically 2 windows on the side, made for a much quieter cockpit. So the joy of the MD-80 was it was so nice and quiet. The terror of the MD-80 was the air conditioning was a joke. And it was just, I used to bring my portable fan and suction cup it to the window, try to get some air moving in there. And but the MD-80s did a lot of long-range flying for Continental. I flew, kind of routinely Houston, Los Angeles. Los Angeles, Houston would be a day's run for me. And I really enjoyed it because it was a comfortable airplane. The 2 seats and the 3 seats made it for a little bit less crowded feeling than the 3 and 3 setup. And, there was kind of a cadre of people who flew it. We used to joke that the MD-80 was, they kind of called it the lawn dart, or because it was so long and skinny.
Skinny, yeah.
Yeah, but it was a nice landing airplane. It's hard to land airliners that are very long, that have a very short height. And so you have to land with a very flat attitude because it's pretty easy to bang the tail on landing.
Yeah.
So what was nice is when I transitioned to the 757, it was just about that time that Continental started buying their very long 757s. And we had no problem transitioning because we were really used to very long airplanes. And a 757 is quite a bit higher off the ground than an MD-80.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of interesting flights through Mexico and through I tried to stay out of the Northeast, but in those days on the MD-80, I wasn't really senior enough. So I saw a little more of the East Coast than I liked. I can remember being in I think it was Philadelphia on the first day of the Eastern Airlines strike sometime back in the 80s and waiting something like 4 hours to be de-iced because there was nobody there and everything was moving extremely slowly.
Yeah.
But no, I think what I remember most about the MD-80 was the heat. But, it was a real honest airplane. It had nothing particularly fancy. An HSI was about a horizontal situation indicator, which is a glorified heading indicator, was about the fanciest thing they had. There was nothing glass or sophisticated about it. You earned your way. It was a lot of work and a lot of takeoffs and landings.
Yeah.
But I always used to laugh. My criteria for space in the cockpit, once you move to the 757, you said, wow, this is really cool. You've got all this room. You can stand up in it. Of course, what I had to jokingly tell myself was that in an MD-80, you could move the captain's seat farther aft than you could in a 757. And the way we determined that was, could you put a meal tray on your lap and not have the yoke keep hitting you?
That's a good criteria there, Karen. I like that.
So it was kind of an interesting case of, gee, I can get myself out of the way of the yoke to eat my lunch in an MD-80. Why can't I do it in a 757? Mr. Boeing, you need some work on this cockpit.
Let's go back to those designers. Come on, Boeing.
Right.
Cool. So you moved on to the 757, 767. Is that where you finished your career?
I did. I never took an upgrade. I could have been a 777 captain. I could have been a 787 captain. I had no real interest in flying a lot of those long, all-night, over-water flights. Part of the reason was I lived in California, and most of those flights were flown out of either the East Coast of the United States or out of Houston. And the thought of commuting all day so you could fly all night didn't do anything for me. I also felt that everybody who flew the all-night flights, because they would have to alternate day and night flying. The crews who fly to Europe fly all night to get there. And once they're there, they then are expected to sleep the next night, and then they're supposed to fly back the next day. But a lot of that, I looked at my friends, and they all looked a whole lot older. And I said, I can look old on my own. I don't need any help.
Hey, I've put the years into flying the MD-80. My skin's looking beautiful, so I don't want to make it older.
There you go. So with that, I felt, I was really in this for the joy of flying, the type of flying I liked. And I said, I'm not going to chase the dollar because I'd really like to enjoy my retirement. So I looked hard for the kinds of flights I liked so I could do the best quality flying and have the best quality time off, because I commuted for 36 plus years. I never lived in the city where I was based. So I had a lot of extra work to go to get to work, which you have to do on your own time and nickel, and to get home from work. So having a good schedule that took me someplace where I wanted to go was important to me.
Absolutely. And can you remember your final flight?
Oh, yes, very definitely. That was also another interesting case that the schedules had gotten so bad that I was looking very hard to find a flight that ended in Los Angeles, even though I was based in Houston, and all the flights technically end in Houston. I was looking for something that would let me land the airplane in Los Angeles and not fly a deadhead leg, which means I would sit there as a passenger to go all the way back to Houston. No. Because we were allowed to not fly the deadhead, just get off, go home. So with that, I must have looked through 300 different possible combinations, and I finally found one that had a leg from Los Angeles to Kona in the big island of Hawaii, and stayed overnight. And the next day we flew from Kona to San Francisco, stayed overnight, and then the last leg was a flight from San Francisco to Los Angeles. And that, as they said, was all she wrote.
Wow. The Continental at that time, did they do anything special for your last flight, or were you just a number and disappear off into the woodwork?
Well, it's funny is if I had chose a flight that had ended in Houston, because Texas does not have a drought, you would have gotten the traditional water spout salute, which is they position 2 fire trucks on either side of you, and as you taxi in after your last landing, the fire trucks shoot an arch of water for you to taxi through to thank you for your years of service. Yeah. Of course, I chose to end in Los Angeles in California, where we have a drought and nobody was offering any extra water to do anything. Oh, and fantastic. They even said, even if there was water, there wasn't any assurance that you would get the water spout, because if the fire department's busy, forget it. Yeah. And Los Angeles is a very crowded, airport, and, getting all that set up is likely impossible. So with that, no water salute. And I said, fine. The final flight, by that time we were, named United Airlines, and they had done a nice, here's a salute to your captain on her final flight for the last leg. And then when I got to Los Angeles, they had a nice little kind of a retirement cake and a little short ceremony in the chief pilot's office. So that was very nice.
Yeah, sounds a little moment there. And just sort of on a sort of personal level, 36 plus years in the airlines, when you sort of wrapped up, dotted the I's, crossed the T's on the paperwork and closed the door, what was that like, knowing that you weren't going to fly or probably fly another airline again?
Well, I had known, I was one of the very lucky ones. In 2007, I actually volunteered to go to Washington, D.C. and work with a group called the Professional Pilots Association, who were working to help change the retirement age for commercial pilots from 60 to 65. And I realized that after helping to lobby Congress and talk to the legislators, that this was something that would help me directly. And in fact, in the fall of 2007, they changed the retirement age. Otherwise, I would have retired in 2009. So I always felt like I was given 5 extra years of being senior.
Yeah.
You know, I jokingly say the real problem was by that time we were starting to merge with United, and the schedules for us in Houston were terrible. So what's the use of being a senior when there's nothing that you particularly want to fly?
Yeah.
On the other hand, I was very lucky to have that time, and I kind of spent it, should we say, practicing up for retirement. I started flying when I could, about half time, figuring there's going to come a day when you can't fly. So you've got to enjoy it as much as you can and do the part of the flying that you really enjoy, and don't do the part of the flying that you don't enjoy. So if you're just doing it to make money, you need to ask yourself, is that a very important criteria to me, or is remembering each of the flights that you do fly as something that was special and enjoyable and fulfilling?
Yeah.
That's probably more important.
Totally agree with that. Especially, you know, the money is money, comes and goes, but the memories of flights, especially when you can't do certain things in the future, that's what we hold on to. It's about the experiences which are even more valuable than money itself. So I get that totally.
Right. I always remember you were talking about MD-80 experiences. One of the things that's always been my mantra is helping people to help themselves. And I was very, very rewarded. I had a retirement party here at Santa Barbara, and I had a number of friends who showed up, and they did a very nice kind of roasting of Karen, and a number of them talking about the things I had done to encourage them and the ways that they were going to give back. About 6-8 months before I retired, a flight attendant came on board, and she was dragging along another flight attendant. She says, "Come on, you have to meet Karen." So she brought her friend up to the cockpit, and she said, "I want you to know that this woman here, 12 years ago, when my son was only 14, we had an MD-80 flight from Houston to Mexico City.
Yeah.
And we were getting ready to close the door. And I had taken my son," she said, "with me on this overnight. And now they were refusing to put him on the airplane because we were weight limited. And they needed to not allow any non-revenue passengers because of the weight. And Karen told the station chief that if they didn't let my son go on the flight, she wasn't going to go." She says, "I was so thrilled." And so I said, "Yep, I figured out that we would burn up the weight of your son in gasoline pounds about, 2 taxiways down the road there," and that it was totally ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I've always figured what comes around goes around, and there are times to kick up your heels and make a fuss, and there are other times when you say, "I'll put up with it." But that was a case where I was really pleased, and of course I had forgotten all about it.
Yeah.
And so it was really nice when she reminded me of that.
Yeah, that's beautiful, especially exercising your pilot in command, but obviously also common sense as well, and doing a good deed in turn, which again, like you said, 12 years later comes back and you get repaid by that. So that's really nice. Okay. So I've mentioned in the bio that you are an author, a speaker. This is what you're doing now, right? In your retirement?
Right. My book, Flight Guide for Success, is something I started writing as I developed my pilot career counseling service, Aviation Career Counseling. I'd started it in the late 80s because I found there was really nobody out there who was willing to speak honestly and openly and in an unbiased manner with people who were trying to get their pilot's license, get through their ratings. And there was a fair amount of assistance out there for people who were all ready to go to the airlines. They just needed some polish up, but there was not much for the person who'd completed their ratings, maybe had about 400 hours, and was trying to get through that wasteland up to 1,000 or 1,500. So I thought what I'd really like to see is having people figure out how they can best help themselves. So I started the career counseling service and ended up writing a number of articles for a variety of different aviation magazines. And finally figured out that the advice in the book was really what I wanted to tell people, and I wanted to give it to them in the least expensive, most expeditious way possible. So the book, Flight Guide for Success, was originally published in about 1998, and then the third edition came in 2003. And people say, well, gee, isn't it current? And I say, well, the same advice still works. And I've had other people suggest, it's really a prescription for how to do for a living, which you'd love to do anyway, and have somebody believe in you and help you. Because we've all been helped by somebody, but we don't want to waste our help. So I've always said to people who call me and say, I'd like to do your career counseling, or they look at my website, CaptainKarenKahn.com, and say, oh, gee, I want the counseling. And I say, well, actually, what you really want is the book. Because you need to read the book first, absorb it. It may answer all your questions. If it does, that's great. If it doesn't, then we'll sit down and talk about you specifically and your personal situation. But for now, I'm interested in helping people who want to help themselves. And reading the book, absorbing it, there's a lot of personal experience in there. People who complain, why won't they hire me? Why won't they interview me? Which rating should I get when? What do I do if I can't get through this rough spot? I've got this bad stuff in my background. What kind of education do I need? How do I get ahead? How do I find a job? All those things are such common concerns for people in the aviation industry, and very honestly, for any industry, that I took all of my experiences and really put them into the book and said, hey, if you're serious, read the book. There's a lot of good information there. And then we'll move forward from that if you still want to talk about your situation.
Yeah. So you mentioned the initial book was released in 1988. Was that right?
It was actually 1998, I think, or 97 or 8 was the first edition. And now the current edition, which has got the black cover, slick, perfect bound. It's the one that basically tells you the stuff you need to know, has nothing terribly fancy, but it's got the honest stuff that most of the people in aviation who are out there and available to help you really want to see you demonstrate to them. A lot of it's attitude, a lot of it's avoiding sounding like somebody who kind of wants it, but only if it's easy, and nobody being willing to pay their dues. So demonstrating to all those people who'd like to help you, because we'd all love to pass on, our assistance to somebody, but we really hate it when we pass it on to somebody who doesn't make good use of it.
Yeah, it's sort of like a waste, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. It's really tough when you have an opportunity for somebody and you don't have anybody to give it to, because nobody's demonstrated to you that they're really working hard to get ahead. And if they would have, they'd be first on your list.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm sure the book, I'll make sure it's linked in your show notes along with everything else that we talk about today. But if you had to give, what's the top 2 bits of advice that evergreen bits of advice that you could give to a prospective, airline pilot?
Well, a lot of it is everybody's unique. Your job is to figure out what's unique about you and let other people know about it. Not in a bragging way, but in an I'm really proud that I've had the opportunity to have these experiences and I'm looking to have more. Attitude is really the deal breaker, because if you think about sitting 8 hours a day in a cockpit with somebody for 3 or 4 days and needing to hire people who have a really good attitude, not just that attitude that they put on for the interviewer that makes the interviewer think that you're doing just fine. So it's using stories in your own history to demonstrate that that's the real you. You've always had a good attitude. You are out there to help people. You are passionate about aviation. If anybody thinks you're in it for the money, and even if you think you're in it for the money, you probably got yourself in the very wrong business. So I think it's being aware of what's special about you and having, a really good attitude and being out there to help aviation, not just you.
Excellent. I like that. Attitude and being aware of what's special about you. So sometimes we're our own worst salesman, woman, person. So totally get that. And I'm sure that if you are an aspiring pilot, you can, I like that one, aspiring pilot, inspired pilot. You can take a look at Karen's book, The Flight Guide for Success Tips and Tactics for the Aspiring Airline Pilot. Okay, Karen, I really like your website. Could you sort of go over, so this is CaptainKarenKahn.com. You've got a lot of stuff going on there. When did this come about? What's the sort of main traffic purpose of the website?
The website was really started about 5 years ago. I've done quite a bit of speaking. What's fun is I recently had here at our local community college, Marketing 101 wanted to use my book as a textbook for the class on, how to sell yourself. And that's what the book is about, is selling yourself. And the website is kind of that way too. Websites, it's fun, staying involved with aviation. So the homepage are kind of the things I've been doing. And then we've got a page under the author tab, which talks a bit about the various things you'll find in the book, why it's been helpful, how to get a copy of it. We move on to pilot counseling, and one of the things I did was record a few videos that really talk about what the counseling is, what it isn't, and what are the different types of counseling we offer. The news is kind of what's going on, where I've been speaking. The travel log is fun because I love to travel, and there's also a fun trip that we did I had a friend come on the airplane and do a sample pre-flight with me of a 757 as if before I took one of my flights from Los Angeles to Houston. So there's a number of different videos there.
Yeah, that's good.
And the blog has just been kind of recently things that I got to thinking about as I've been transitioning to doing more general aviation flying. In my writing, I also had written, in addition to career books, I had also done a lot of educational material for pilots. I had worked with the Pilot's Audio Update with several of the flying magazines on helping to present to general aviation pilots the same type of safety information that airlines give their pilots. So using whatever airline pilots learned about, for example, dealing with emergencies, about dealing with strange airports, about planning your descents, all of the things that make a professional pilot career different from a general aviation pilot career. Those things have also been ones that I have written about. And so there are various ones I've got here in blogs. And of course, I'm also interested to hear from listeners who are thinking, gee, well, how do you do this or how do you do that? Because one of the more common requests I get now is speaking to groups of people who are not pilots, but who fly a lot and who don't understand an awful lot of what goes on behind the cockpit door, which is one of my, should we say, favorite workings, because, of course, a lot of people don't realize airliners never, quote, fill it up like you do pretty routinely in GA airplanes. Yeah. They put on as much fuel as they need. And the interesting, mental dialogue that all goes into figuring out how much fuel you do need, which is a very big deal in commercial aviation. It's a very big deal in general aviation, but it's a different mindset as to what you have to be thinking about in a situation where you've got 200 plus passengers and, a certain amount of fuel and maximum landing weights and all kinds of things that are considerations. So a lot of it's always being aware, as I used to say, of my favorite warning: how will it sound at the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, hearing? If something goes wrong and they come to you and say, why did you do that? Probably say, oh, I forgot, or gee, I was tired, or gee, I didn't think it would happen that way. So I'm always trying to point out to people that looking now for consequences of your actions later is really important. And think about, what it's going to do before you do it. If you don't like the way it sounds at the hearing, don't do it.
Yeah, and that's making the assumption that you're actually there at the hearing to hear, if you're lucky enough, So.
Exactly. But, if you think of the most prized thing you own is your pilot's license, then you think about somebody taking it away, and maybe that's what you want to think about before you charge off into the weather that's kind of less than VFR and kind of marginal, or you decide, oh, gee, I think it's okay. Nah, there's no ice out there. When in doubt, don't is awfully good mantra to make sure you end up flying another safe day.
Fantastic. Okay, so check out CaptainKarenKahn.com. That's Karen's blog and website. Great resource, lots of interesting stuff, and definitely worth checking out. I'll make sure that is linked to in your show notes. Okay, you've had a 36 plus year career in the airlines. Before that, you had a numerous number of years flying general aviation. So let's have a look. I think it might be a tough question, but what is your proudest moment in your flying career so far? Tell us that story.
I think it's helping people get to where they wanted to go. And it's always fun when you have a story that you've been using over and over. And when it finally got through to the person that they finally got it, because you thought for the longest time that they didn't. I had a case years ago where I was really looking forward to flying with my first female co-pilot. And when I finally had the opportunity to do that, it was actually quite a big disappointment. And it wasn't until maybe 20 years later that that same person, because what had happened was after the first flight, we had another flight a week later. And I kind of said, there's a number of things you're doing that aren't particularly professional. And I had told her what it was I felt she needed to know. And she had ended up calling in sick the next day. And we never flew together again. And about 20, maybe even 25 years later, we were both at a women pilots meeting. I'm one of the founders of the International Society of Women Airline Pilots, and they meet every year. And just about 2 years ago, we happened to be standing around waiting for one of the dinner events to begin. And she came up to me, and it was really amazing. She said, I don't know if you remember that time we flew together. And I was thinking to myself,
Yep.
Not only do I remember it, but I have used it as an example of some of the things you got to be real careful with in your career. And she said, but you really taught me a lot. She says, I didn't realize that one of the things you had complained about, which was my, should we say, overly casual voice on the radio when talking to air traffic control. And she said, I didn't understand until much later how important what you were telling me was. And I thought to myself, well, what do you know?
Yeah.
When you figure nobody's ever going to get it, and they finally do. So it was very gratifying because I thought to myself, you try your best, because the problem, and we could spend a whole nother show on talking about women in aviation and the different challenges they faced, because regardless of where they go, they're always going to be noticed. And they're, in my mind and in my counseling practice, I've always counseled them that you have to be in certain areas much better than the men. You can't falter because it's something they're always going to be checking you on. And if you are proficient and professional in what you do, you will have no problem. But if you're not, that's the first thing they're looking for is, it's like somebody sticking out their foot to trip you as you walk by.
Yeah.
But if you demonstrate that you meet every standard, meet or exceed, then you've got it made. People know you're serious about what you do. So I was trying to point out that it was bad enough that we were female in terms of being overly scrutinized. And when they do look closely, we have to make sure that they see the very best that's out there and not have somebody just decide because you were female that you shouldn't be doing your job, which when I first started, we used to fly the airline, and when you would hear a female voice on the radio, every now and then you would hear a comment like this from a male voice: barefoot, pregnant, and chained to the kitchen.
Damn, really?
Oh, yeah. So there was a lot of that went on. And, what was very gratifying over the years was that the younger generation thought nothing unusual about seeing women pilots in the cockpit. What was always funny was the older people who were always oohing and ahhing and, oh, wow, look, we've got a woman pilot. And I always used to joke and say, yeah, and the airplane doesn't even know the difference.
Very good. I'm sure you got really good at those hitbacks. Yeah, cool.
Well, we try not to be too, should we say, snarky or sarcastic about it. I once had the MD-80, I don't know if you recall, had the overhead panel, had a lot of switches and lights and dials. And at one point, we had a flight that was delayed because we had an electrical problem, and they had actually dropped that overhead panel down, and they were working on it. And some woman in first class was looking at that, got up, gathered her belongings, and stomped off the airplane and said, humph, I'm not flying on any airplane that has electrical problems. And I said, lady, neither am I. That's why we're getting it fixed.
Good call. Good call. So going back to your the original special moment, over 20 years later, you mentioned a couple of times where, you let the flight attendant's son fly, several years later, it comes back. So this time it took a little longer, but it sort of validated a point that you made. And like you said, you used as a sort of quotes training anecdote for students, etc. So good stuff. Love that.
Yeah, there's a lot of situations where you think, oh, I'll never hear anything about that again. And then later it pops up and you're reminded, yeah, I'm really glad I handled it in the way I did, because I have a clear conscience, and eventually somebody is going to figure out that it was meant to help them as well. So I like helping people, and I like helping people help themselves. I think that's my big rule. And so if I can make it easier for them to do their job, that's another one of my mantras in life. Make it easy for people to do for you what you want them to do. Don't make them work at it. If you want somebody to write you a letter of recommendation, help them out. Tell them what they need to know about you, because it's very likely that the person doesn't know all the good things about you that you know. So send them a nice laundry list. Send them a sample letter. Remind them what kind of interactions you've had. Even send them another sample letter that somebody else has written for you. But, people hate doing extra work. So if you make it easy for them, they're going to be much more inclined to do what you want them to do.
Fantastic. Help people to help themselves and make it easy for people to help you. That's I love those mantras.
And give them the tools they need to do the job, so that expecting somebody to do something for you when they don't have the tools to do it is, in my mind, ridiculous. Give them the information they need so that it's just like the letter of recommendation. Give them the tool to do the job so that you can make it easy for them.
Fantastic. Okay, so quick one. You've got your aviation career counseling business. You have your book. So tell us about your future plans and aspirations in aviation. You're doing a lot of good there. You're a member of lots of societies, lots of associations. So what's the future for Karen over the next 22 plus flying years and everything else?
I think one of my passions is, public speaking. I enjoy sharing my love of aviation with the rest of the world. There's a lot of things misunderstood about aviation. So I also like very much helping women do a better job, helping them move up in worlds that are, highly competitive and mostly populated with, should we say, male counterparts. So one of my things is helping to inspire women to do a better job.
Fantastic. Well, I wish you all the best with your speaking and helping women basically onto an even playing field.
That's it, is learning how to use what you know to get ahead, making it easier for others to help you, demonstrating to those who can help you that you're really worth helping and really serious about what you're doing.
Fantastic. Okay, Karen, this is my favorite part of the show. Welcome to the Quick Fire Checklist. This is where I ask you a series of questions and you come back to us, the inspired pilots, with amazing and inspiring answers. How does that sound? You ready, Karen?
Sounds good.
Okay, let's go. What is the best piece of advice related to flying that you've ever received?
If it doesn't sound good at the hearing, don't do it.
If it doesn't sound good at the hearing, don't do it. Love that. And we've talked about that as well. So great. Do you have a favorite internet flying resource that you'd like to share with the listeners?
I just learned about flightplan.com, FLTPLAN.com. Looks like a wonderful website that lets you do a lot of good flight planning, provides a lot of information, all for free.
Okay, flightplan.com. I'll make sure that's linked to on your show notes. Can you share one of your personal habits that you find useful and you believe contributes to your flying success, Karen?
I think it's planning ahead. It's imagining myself doing all the steps that will take me through a flight before I ever do it, so that I ask myself, because I've visualized myself doing the pre-flight on the airplane, getting in, collecting the charts, and do I have everything that I need? I'm always trying to think ahead as to what I will need, so I don't end up wishing that I had done that, so I wouldn't have forgotten what one easily could.
Fantastic. Yeah, we've heard of that before. The power of visualization, can't be underestimated. So good stuff. Okay, trikes or tail draggers, Karen?
Definitely trikes. I'm a real klutz when it comes to a tail dragger. I've soloed a Cub once, and I lived to talk through the ground loop. I didn't loop. I just ended up doing 90 degrees difference in the direction I thought I was going to go.
Yeah, it's like turning with style. Okay. As well as your own, can you recommend one aviation-related book?
Well, there's two that have always been my favorites. They were kind of my Bibles when I started out training. One was Weather Flying by Robert Buck, and the other was Instrument Flying by Richard Taylor. Those have both got more updated versions than I started out reading, but they're marvelous books. And then I really enjoyed North Star Over My Shoulder, also by Robert Buck. Fascinating story of the airline history in its early days and his growing up through the Second World War and running a full airline career and all the fascinating things he saw.
Okay, excellent. I'll make sure those books are linked to on your show notes page. You've just recently had the glass panel in your Beechcraft Baron, but what is your favorite non-essential but essential to you technology gadget in your cockpit?
Boy, interesting question. My cockpit. Actually, it's a marvelous thing that I just saw them selling again. It's not terribly tech, but it sure is handy.
Tell me.
It is called a HUG, H-U-G light. It is what looks like an open-ended necklace that has at either ends of it 2 flashlights. And these will shine down. They can actually be manipulated or bent like a snake to point at anything you want. And they have about small LEDs at the end of it. But it's a great way, particularly in a general aviation cockpit, to illuminate what's in your lap. You can bend it to illuminate what's on the floor. And you could bend it to make a halo out of it if you wanted to. But
yeah.
It's a fascinating gadget that I like very much. And that and a straight old 8.5 by 11 clipboard turned sideways.
Fantastic. And where can you get this HUG light? I've never heard of that before. Where can you buy them from?
I got mine at Costco, the big warehouse store. And I bought one years ago that I've been using forever and just noticed about 3 weeks ago they were back selling them again.
Okay, I'll try and find a picture of the HUG light and put that on your show notes as well, because it sounds really interesting. Okay, this is my favorite question, Karen. If you had a time machine and could go back in time and meet your younger self just as you're about to start your flying journey back into 1969, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself?
Well, I had always realized that if I had known that I was interested in aviation, I would have gone to an aviation college and gotten all of my ratings in an orderly academic setting that would have let me finish college with all of the training pretty much that I needed. And that's the kind of advice that I give to people who are in that situation and have that opportunity, or at least go to an aviation-friendly school that has a flying club or something like that. But I would have started much early. I started at 19, but I had, in my mind, kind of wasted 2 years wandering around trying to find something that I liked, and ended up having to later finish college and do all of my ratings independent of school.
Okay, so definitely start earlier and go to a focused college, focused aviation college. Good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, Inspired Pilots, you can find all the links to all the resources and everything else we've been talking today with Karen by going to inspiredpilot.com and search for Karen in the search bar to find the show notes for this episode. Okay, Karen, like you said, we could have a whole new show on a lot of different topics that you've mentioned along the way there. But listening to your journey and the stories you've shared have been great. I love the MD-80 stories. It's a little, I think I used to fly it on a flight simulator. And I've just remembered now why I've got a little soft spot for it. I hope the listeners enjoy that too. Can you give the audience of Inspired Pilots one last piece of guidance and share how people can get in contact with you? And then we'll sign off.
I think my best piece of advice is we in aviation are very lucky in that we don't toil endlessly on a tough journey that has no rewards just to get to some pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. We are lucky in that everything we do as we work to upgrade our ratings and to acquire more experience, it's all fun stuff. It all contributes. I would say keep good records, because someday you'll be needing to remember those things so that you can tell the stories that will help someone else.
Great. Personally, I really like that bit of advice there. I'm actually looking at my logbook now, and in that little space next to each line on my logbook, I try to be as verbose as possible and put some key moments in there. So yeah, I love that. And you definitely mentioned, some careers you have to toil and work hard, and maybe you'll get that retirement pot of gold like you mentioned at the end. But every flight is a blessing and is a lot of fun as well. So what a great piece of advice. Thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Okay, thank you, Karen, for joining us on the show, for your time today. You've been very generous. On behalf of the Inspired Pilots, I'd like to say thank you and speak to you again.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. Fly safe, fly smart.
Thank you for joining me today for episode 24 of the Inspired Pilot podcast. A slightly longer episode than normal today, but what a great storyteller Karen is. I'm sure she's got a million other stories that she could have shared with us today. What I like about Karen's story is that she put in the work to follow her passion. In reality, I'm sure she wasn't the first teenager to go against the wishes of her parents, but 45 years ago, her pursuit to learn to fly and her career choice was against the social norms of that particular era. Karen put in the work, she hustled, and did whatever she had to do to make it happen. There were definitely no chinks in the Karen Kahn determination armor when it came to making her dream her actual reality, and I think we can all learn from this. Post-airline career, you can tell that Karen really enjoys and is real passionate about helping others to learn how to sell themselves to prospective employees. And why not take a shortcut, You don't need a 36-plus year career to learn what Karen has picked up along the way, but you can always leverage her knowledge and experience and learn from her and from people like her. Real talk, you can't substitute real flying time or even real life experience, but you can have the second best thing, and that is to learn from the successes, failures, and lessons of others that have been on this journey before you. So yes, definitely something to think about there. Don't forget to check out Karen's website, as I said in the interview. It really is a fantastic resource. Okay, you can find the show notes for this episode by heading over to the show's website, inspiredpilot.com. You can also leave a comment there for Karen directly on the page and find the links to all the resources mentioned and much, much more. I really appreciate receiving feedback about the show, so do get in touch. I reply to every single email, and I'm active on Facebook and Twitter. If you do like the show, I'll be really grateful if you share it with your fellow AvGeeks, friends and colleagues. And if you do feel inclined, please leave a rating and review on iTunes with as many stars as possible, as this helps increase the show's exposure and therefore getting the journeys of our featured inspiring pilots in front of and inspiring more people, which is, as I've said before, the whole mission of the podcast. And don't forget, wherever you are on your pilot journey, get ready to be inspired.